Welcome to Some Things Considered, the podcast where we are obsessed with story. We celebrate creativity and we talk to cool people to find out what makes them tick. I'm your host, Sean Murphy. I'm an author. I direct the Center for Story at Shenandoah University, and I run the nonprofit 1455 Lit Arts. For more about me and what I do, check out seanmurphy.net. Hey, everybody, welcome back to Some Things Considered. This is the podcast where we celebrate storytelling, we're obsessed with creativity, and my main goal in life is to find interesting people and find out what makes them tick. And I learn a lot in the process. I hope you do too. I'm so fortunate. My network continues to expand, and I'm lucky to know a lot of amazing people that I've been happy to keep in touch with. Today's guest is not only no exception. This is our first time, even though we've been on similar dance cards. He's participated in some programming that I've sponsored, and I've been a fan from afar. But it's with tremendous pleasure that I welcome Tim Wendel to today's podcast. Let me read you his bio, and this is the short version. Very, very impressive. Tim's books include Summer of '68, Castro's Curveball, Cancer Crossings, and many other works. His latest, the historical novel Rebel Falls, won the W.I. Boyd Award from the American Library Association. A longtime writer in residence at Johns Hopkins University, his stories and columns have appeared in some small outlets that you might have heard of called Esquire, GQ, the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, National Geographic, and more. Tim, welcome, and thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure. This is going to be fun. And I've always, as I was saying as we were coming in, the stuff you're churning out, the amount of content is just it's great. And not just podcasts, but all the Substack stuff. It's really, really classy stuff.
Well, thank you for that. A definitely mutual admiration society. And I think, like I said, I mean, one benefit of being staying curious and really enjoying talking to other creatives is, it's an inexhaustible list. So my work is cut out for me because I always want to learn and take lessons from people. So dare I flatter you again, but I'll say I've learned a lot from you. I think we're going to learn a lot from you today. But before we jump in, I feel obliged to acknowledge we're talking in mid-October. The air is crisp and it's baseball season. I know you're a huge baseball fan, so we will definitely get into that. And in fact, doing my research for this, and this is like a manifestation and an epitome of how the process works. Um, I know that you're a big baseball fan, but checking out your Substack there, and just this weekend I had revisited literally umpteenth time a movie I first saw in the theater, Bull Durham. I think
Mm.
sentimental. I was getting geared up for the playoffs, but I hadn't seen the movie in a while. And sure enough, I go to your Substack and there's an article about a character I'd never heard of, who Nuke Lelouch is ostensibly based on, Steve Dalkowski. So, how about that for a random intro to our conversation, talking about baseball and writing, two things that you have a tremendous passion for.
Yeah, very much. I mean, it's funny. I covered baseball for a number of years, Sean. As you know, I was one of the founders of Baseball Weekly at USA Today. Oh, gosh, was that 91, something like that. And before that, had done some baseball for the San Francisco Examiner on the West Coast. I don't miss baseball per se, but I miss it this time of the year. You know, I didn't miss it like on a beat and covering it for a whole season. That ground me down after a while. But I miss it right now. And I'll be up, watching it through the end of the season and such. And it's funny you brought up Bull Durham because that's one of the movies kind of we queue up in my household a little bit. It drives my wife a little crazy, but she likes Bull Durham too. And we were watching it the other day, and the whole Steve Dalkowski thing came on. They said, I got to do a Substack on Delco, so I ended up doing it.
And of course, having grown up in the Northern Virginia area, I am a Red Sox fan from family. I was born into it, but grew up in between Nationals teams. So of course, watched a lot of the Orioles. I loved it in that piece you wrote. Of course, there's a couple of Earl Weaver anecdotes. Speaking of storytelling and legends and people that were ambassadors for the game.
Very much. I mean, Earl Weaver and a couple of the old managers. like I was getting started in baseball, and this is good gosh, this is late 80s, almost mid 80s, I guess. Him, Roger Craig, Tony La Russa to a certain extent. But I came in, I was very young then. I was very kind of hyped up. And I was like covering baseball, maybe like it would football. You know, every game was like make or break. And both Weaver and Roger Craig, in their own ways, pulled me aside at different points, and they just we got to talk. And pretty much they said, "You've got to remember, Tim, we play this game every day. So in other words, chill out, will you?" And it was dead on. I didn't know you were a Red Sox fan. I grew up a Red Sox fan too, so that's something we have in common.
Well, I mean, one of the ways I rationalize, although it's very genuine, when the Sox went out, there's the momentary heartbreak, but then there's this feeling of now I can watch the games and actually enjoy them. And so there is something bizarre about, and this I think applies to any sport, but if your team's not playing, you really can just you can see it through a much more objective lens. I
Well, the
dare
whole
say.
the whole pageantry rolls out as opposed to you're living and dying on every pitch type of thing.
Yeah. Well, and I have to wonder as it relates to your sensibility. I mean, I catch myself straining at an easy metaphor, but a long baseball season, not unlike writing a book, right? In the sense that both of those endeavors to field a winning team, to write a book, we get so caught up when we talk about writing or when we hear writing talked about by people that don't practice it, this flash of inspiration, these geniuses that walk the earth, both of which happen and we love. But the reality is it's a grind and it's all about showing up every day, putting in the time. I guess one of the many things I admire about you and your writing is being able to make those connections, thinking deeply about how baseball works, how writing works, and then getting the work done.
Yeah, but thank you for that. It's funny because it is a grind, and it took me maybe a long time to understand that. And I realize that as you're bringing that up, probably it wasn't just say Earl Weaver, but some of the players I covered over the years, like Paul Molitor, Ricky Henderson, et cetera. That they were kind of the consummate pros. And what I mean, and I think everybody's got different definitions of a pro. And I
Yeah.
remember talking about this with Alan Shoes, who used to teach at George Mason, one of my mentors. And we kind of agreed a pro does it every day. In a sense, they get up and they grind it out. They aren't looking necessarily for inspiration. And that's something I try to convey to my grad students at Johns Hopkins. If you're waiting for the lightning bolt all the time, that's maybe not going to get a lot done. In my mind, whether it's the ball players or the writers or the creatives, they're the ones who go at it every day, knowing that some days they're going to fly and other days they're going to crash, but they accept that as part of the agenda.
Yeah, and I can sense some people's eyes glazing over, like, oh, here come two writers talking about having to sit down at the desk. But I think, first of all, that happens to be true. And I think those of you out there, when you read or hear writers talking about craft, invariably some type of formulation of that sentiment will emerge. But also, you gave me a compliment about producing content. I do think it's part and parcel to showing up, acknowledging the grind. I have to do this because it shouldn't be unpleasurable, but it's
Hmm.
work. But it's when you're showing up every day that inspiration can strike, or something that you didn't set out to do. In my case, it could be a poem, it could be an essay or a short story, etc. Those things, it helps to have a plan. It's wonderful when inspiration strikes. But showing up every day, it should be this yin yang of hard work, but also loving what you're doing, and that's how you can build proficiency.
Yeah, exactly. It's definitely a yin yang, and if inspiration is going to strike, in many ways, you have to be ready for it. You have to be prepared. I mean, one of the things that was driven home to me about this is I did my first novel when I was still at Baseball Weekly at USA Today. I was kind of doing it at night. I was doing it, and the only time I had regular was on the Metro riding from Vienna on the Orange Line to Roslyn, where USA Today was at that point. That was my job. And my kids were young then. It seemed like I had no time. And yet I had, where is it? I've got it here. I still use this, spiral notebook thing. And, and, and I was getting on the metro one day and I roughly had 20, 25 minutes in that commute. And that's when I wrote. And one day I got on the metro and it was already a bad day. And to this day, I can't quite figure out what had happened. That I have argued with my wife, that something happened at home. And I got on the metro and I was so worked up that early in the morning. I said, well, I'm not going to write today. I'm not going to get out my notebook. And it's kind of funny sometimes when we get sidetracked, the one we tend to take it out on is ourselves, especially if we're working on projects. And I got halfway to Roslyn, and as you well know, Metro. I mean, it goes below ground right around Ballston. And it was something about going below ground that got me really feeling guilty and antsy. And I got out the notebook and I said, hang on, you said you were going to do this. This is a pact you made with yourself. Nobody else cares if you're writing. And I
Right.
started to write very quickly in my notebook because my stop's coming up. And all of a sudden, here was my stop. Time to go to work. I think at that point I had, good God, 8 to 10 people reporting to me. Days were like sticking my finger in an electrical socket. That's the way I felt work was. And I got home that night and I pulled out the notebook and I'd written kind of outside the lines. I was all over. It was in a first person voice, Sean. I had not written much in first person to that point. I hadn't done a lot of essays and columns and such like you. And 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 I liked this voice. And I was working on this novel at that point set in Cuba. We had a good title for it, Castro's Curveball. And and it was maybe, I'd like to think at that point, maybe half or two-thirds done, but it was in third person. And I felt something was wrong. It was like kind of flat. And yet here was this voice that I'd written in my notebook on the Metro that I like to think was more naive or desperate than my own. I ended up rewriting the whole novel in that voice of this washed up catcher who's playing in Havana trying to further his career. And it's weird. I'll tell my grad students sometimes, to me, that notebook, that spiral notebook is almost like a butterfly net. I can catch great things, but I got to open it. And that doesn't mean each day is going to be, you know, cosmic or very good. But since then, I've tried to do my due diligence.
I mean, there's a whole masterclass comprised of that anecdote. Those poor souls who've seen a lot of these episodes will forgive me, hopefully, because I've brought up this before. But one of my favorite quotes is from the jazz musician Charles Mingus, and he talks about at a certain point in his development, he finally understood, even though he still had day jobs and was really busy and struggling to make ends meet, but he had this breakthrough. He realized I'm always composing music, even or especially when I'm not composing music. He had gotten to a point where he understood his subconscious was working with him and he
Mhm.
was able to channel that energy. And I think writers get to a point where they recognize, I know speaking only for myself, sometimes, and it's very paradoxical on the surface, when I'm busiest and genuinely a little overwhelmed, somehow ideas creep in. And there's
Mhm.
that first impulse, which is like to push it away and say, not now. But I've learned to respect saying, maybe it's because I'm so pre-wired that when you allow yourself to let things come in, certain doors are being opened. I think all of these things are in play. And to me, I find it so it's a comfortable kind of algorithm of what we're talking about, like showing up, work, the grind, being totally open to inspiration, but also trusting kind of these inner voices and having the courage to take a book that's almost done and doing it all over again. There's a certain integrity there. And again, I add you to now a list of many similar stories I've read where an author recognized at a certain point, sometimes painfully close to feeling complete, where
Mhm.
they recognize that this is the more important voice, and I need to run with that. I think it takes a tremendous amount of courage, and then of course it pays off because that's the work you've got to live with for the rest of your life if it gets published.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. It's listening to the voices and not holding them at arm's length. And it can be kind of scary to bring them a little bit closer because your immediate instinct is correct. They're going to upset the whole apple cart potentially, and they're going to take all these things. And if I've learned anything over the years, it's to listen to them because they're often leading in a better direction. I guess with my nonfiction, but certainly with my fiction, I'll listen to my character. I'll almost like interview them. And I'll say, right now we're at this. What are you thinking? I don't know. You got to tell me. And when they start to, that's when I think the magical, the alchemy really happens.
I find it, it's always I find it so inspiring and affirming when I read a writer talking about especially fiction, and they'll say a variation of, I was really enjoying spending time with these people. And I
Yeah.
love that because there's a certain genuine appreciation of what we might call kind of the mystical aspect. Like, in other words, it's not a pre-programmed, one of the many reasons AI can't and never will replicate real creation, because we don't always know where it's coming from. And it's that tension between intention and fancy, and harnessing those
Hmm.
competing energies can lead to these breakthroughs. But I find it, to me, it's always a very humble. I can appreciate non-writers reading someone saying, I didn't want to finish the book because I wanted to stay with those people, and rolling their eyes. But I think anyone that's undertaken a long-term project can recognize that there is something very humbling about, you're in love with the project you're working on. I feel like that's when you're chasing something meaningful, and even if it's
Right.
hard work or takes a long time, or heaven forbid, isn't meant to even get published. These are huge milestones in a writer's development.
And they keep you sane to a certain degree. I think they're good for the soul. And I think, and that's maybe the most difficult thing is not all, but a lot of my characters either after a while understand them pretty well, or I kind of even fall in love with them. And then when bad things have to happen to them, which makes up a good story,
Yeah.
oh, that's so difficult. I remember when I went out, it must have been with Curveball. I was out on that first tour with that. And where were we? I think we were in New York at NYU or something. And somebody got up in the back and she had already read the book. We're at the Q&A part of the presentation. She goes, so I didn't care. I don't care much about Cuba. I don't care about that. Fidel Castro, who cares? I'm not much of a baseball fan. And I'm like going, oh my gosh, where's this question going? And then she goes, that Melina Fonseca character who, goes through a lot, who's just like, one of the major players in it. And out of the blue, she goes, that Melina Fonseca character, did you love her? And I went, God, I did. And I realized, that's some of the angst and stuff I went through as I was finishing that book, putting her in such dire danger and such. And my family teases me about it sometimes. They can tell when, something's wrapping up because I'll get kind of morose or, really worried around the house. I'm going, he's about ready to kill off another one or whatever. So it's pretty bizarre.
Well, and that's a wonderful segue to kind of talking about your award-winning most recent work, but also like this combination of research, history. I mean, for historical fiction, kind of duh, but I mean, really talking about, one has to respect and understand the time one's writing about, but also pulling in the things that you've been mentioning, which is, okay, but to populate this, having verisimilitude, very important, almost a no-brainer. Like, to be taken seriously, the writer for historical fiction should have done their homework. There should be conjuring a world that actually existed or is believable. But it's all about having characters that the writer believes in, because I always tell younger writers when I'm asked, if you don't care about your characters, why would you think a reader is going to care about them? So
Mhm.
but again, and as it comes to your writing, I don't think there's kind of an alpha and an omega. It's like these two, uh, you know, abilities and interests are intertwined. This deep research, this impulse to do it right, but having characters that clearly, are real people. We feel they're real people.
Thank you on that. I mean, it's because maybe that's a result of the way I do my research, I guess, to a certain extent, Sean. I mean, you know, we both know. In fact, I was having drinks with a good writing friend of mine last night who does amazing research. He's probably a much better researcher than me. I would argue, maybe I won't tell this to his face, but maybe he spends a little bit too much time on the research. I'll tend to research and then I'll get captivated by something and I'll start to write. And then when it goes flat or it's not working as well, then I know I've got to do more research. So it's a yin yang back and forth, and maybe it keeps me dialed in, it keeps me interested, but that means it can be kind of white knuckling at times. I was just finished the sequel to Rebel Falls, which I hope will be out next year. It'll be at least be out in 2027, and there were some questions on that and it seems like I'm always doing a last minute trip on deadline. I also do this with my nonfiction. I went to
Yeah.
Memphis for like summer of '68, and the last minute trip for this new one was to Ottawa, Canada. People go, "Why are you going to Ottawa?" Well, there was some, ramifications plot, but more importantly, I needed to understand this one character and actually the last couple hours of his life. One of the major characters in the new book is a guy named Darcy McGee, who is a poet, politician, did like 15 books of poetry. He's the one, I would argue he's the guy, the reason we have a Canada today. And I'm somewhat intrigued by Canada because I'm married to a Canadian. And
Okay.
Canada's like all over the place in terms of language and geography. And back in the 1860s, this guy, Darcy McGee, actually an Irishman, held them together. He was assassinated. So I went to Ottawa and did a lot of research at the History Museum there, and they were awesome. They were great. But where things clicked, and I think we're always looking for that click where you can kind of go, yeah, I'm in that person's shoes. I think I know what was motivating them, what was important to them, was walking the street, and Ottawa is still somewhat the same, walking Spark Street at midnight, which is roughly the time he was assassinated coming down from Parliament Hill. And suddenly you're going, I get it. Okay, I think I know. And the weather was kind of the same and everything. So, I think we're always, characters are so important because we bring them into our lives and we kind of want to protect them. But it's like that old, what, Annie Lamont line, bad things have to happen to good people. And that's somewhat the mark of a good story. But you got to have enough courage to put these people in harm's way, which sometimes is really, really tough.
Sure, sure. Um, a little rabbit hole opened up there while you were talking, but I'm resisting because I feel like 2 years ago and before, the logical next question I would have would be diving deeper into characterization and the craft, but I have to do like I have to put a pin in and say one of the things I was looking forward to talking to you about is the very sad reality that the notion of history itself and writing about history has in this calendar year come under attack. Things that I'll speak only for myself, but things that I would have thought if you had predicted a year ago, you'll never talk about this in the context of a writer interview, history and how history has been done and what's been settled and established. That opens up the floodgates of our socio-political moment, but germane to this conversation, this idea that history, of course, is a story or a series of stories, always in progress, always being revised. The problem is, I think the energy of the 20th century was trying to realistically and responsibly make revisions where appropriate for marginalized voices that maybe deserve to have frankly, a less white male lens, but for authenticity, not for, check marks. But now we're wrestling with the idea that things we all agree happened or should have happened are being whitewashed, for a lack of a better pun.
Mhm.
I know this is right in your wheelhouse as someone that writes historical fiction. I think specifically about your Substack that I know, you had mentioned you got some really interesting feedback on. The title of the piece is time for citizen historians to step up.
Yeah.
I would love you to talk a little bit about that piece, but also how we're talking about historical fiction, history, and just the stakes do seem a little different now. And I think that that's a challenge for all writers, but it's also kind of an imperative that those who say leave politics out of it, my retort to that is always politics is already in it. And it's
Yeah.
how we navigate what's coming at us as artists and creatives.
Yeah. It's certainly much more of a strain on everything, but my hope is it takes us to a maybe a better place. A lot of different ways to attack that, but we moved from Northern Virginia, as we were talking about, down to Charlottesville about 7 years ago. Rebel Falls would have been, I think, a much different novel if I was still in Northern Virginia. And part of it was moving here right about the time of the Unite the Right riot and debacle, and seeing
Yeah.
how much that narrative impacted people and just hurt people. And it was funny. I was trying at times to make a joke, but sometimes people would say, "Why did you guys move to Charlottesville?" And there really wasn't any reason that made a complete sense. My kids weren't here at that point. I mean, we didn't really know that many people. I guess we wanted to be somewhat close to DC so we could still get up and see friends. But for a while, I got a little fed up with the question, and my response was, we came to fight Nazis, in a sense, and part of that was very much, we're not sure what we're doing, but part of it was serious too. And I think it's funny. I was just talking a while back to my friend Larry Kerwin, who's done he's got a musical he's working up now for Broadway. He was the front man for a band called Black 47. I went with his tour group about this time last year to Ireland. He's from Ireland originally. There's a huge Irish component in the new book. And we just got talking about history at times and how people maybe they're almost kind of fed up with it. And if they're fed up with it, it means they don't understand it. And you can't put history at arm's length. You can't just say, I'm not dealing with that because it's going to deal with you big time. It dealt with this community I live in big time. And it's funny because I don't think history repeats itself. I think that's a little simplistic. But I think at
Yeah.
times, Sean, history rhymes, the cadences, just the backdrop, whatever gets eerily like other moments
Yeah.
in a nation's history, person's history, whatever it may be. And if you ignore the history, then you're about ready to be tripped up again by it. And I would argue right now in our country, things are rhyming big time, and in terms of, Civil War and such. And one of the things in that Substack column that I got a lot of response for, mostly pro, but some con, but part of me was the genesis of that a little bit was, uh, especially after the last election, I knew through my research for Rebel Falls that the Confederate memorial at Arlington Cemetery was starting to be taken down, which I totally support. And I think it makes sense. I mean, you don't go to Germany and see a lot of monuments for the Third Reich. And
Yeah.
now it's starting to be built back up. And so again, this is the world around us, and you can kind of put on blinders and say, "No, I don't want to know," but it's
Right.
going to want to know you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, thank you for that. I think to me, one of the things that I always want to interrogate is what is the impulse behind either what is now derisively and sarcastically referred to as woke. You almost have to, it originated from a very genuine and I think very noble aspiration to be inclusive. But even the backlash to woke, my thinking was, what is that backlash about and what is it saying? Just like resurrecting Confederate statues, what is the narrative behind that? Is this restoring history or is it trying to restore a narrative that had been defeated? And now
Mhm.
we have to start, if not over again, the battle becomes reclaiming a narrative or telling a better narrative or ensuring that this revision of an established narrative does not win out due to power and due to kind of the
Sure.
bullying force of power and money? And to me, the answer is very clear, but it gets us to, okay, well, as teachers and writers and citizens who care, how do we grapple with this? And how do we get outside of the kind of dichotomy of, well, you feel that way and I feel this way? And it's like, but there has to be some respect for truth and history. I think real history, as it's practiced, are people that are obsessed with getting it right. They might not get it right, or they recognize 20,
Mhm.
30 years from now, it may be a whole different story because new things will emerge. But this desire to get it right, that's what I see lacking in a lot of this reactionary sentiment that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'd rather be awoke than, I guess, asleep or something. But,
Right.
um, it's funny. I think maybe some of it may dovetails back to our earlier conversation about character, because one thing that has been kind of cool about Rebel Falls has been, and it's now being used in some high schools, and I hope it's going to be used more in like some AP, English and
Yep.
drama and history. And there were like, I felt going into that project, there was kind of, especially you kind of put the Civil War out there, and maybe even the way we're taught about it. I felt there was two major kind of holes in it, and it really directed me, not so much right away, but over the course of writing it. The first thing I felt was lacking was a complete, at times, disregard for the role of women in that war. From disguising themselves as men and fighting alongside other men. And that's kind of where the Rory Chase character kind of got its, genesis to being spies, etc. But the other thing that, I'm kind of a history buff. I like history, but I found myself thinking back when I was writing Rebel Falls, how was I taught about the Civil War? I mean, I grew up, up near Niagara Falls. I grew up way up in the northern climes, and I was taught about generals and dates and places that were a long way away from me, Vicksburg and Antietam and Gettysburg, And that was one of the kicks I had, in a sense, when I moved to Virginia initially. I was kind of made closer to those places. I actually go visit them. But when we're taught dates and larger than life figures
Yep.
and battles, where are the people? The people are gone. What were their motivations? Why did so many, not just in our country, but even from out other countries, flock to this war like moths to a flame? And
Mhm.
it didn't really have to do much about politics. It had to do with them and their makeup as individuals. And I think at that point, things become maybe more understandable, and it's a way to maybe better communicate, the whole situation, when you're not saying to some kid, okay, what happened in 1863? Give me an outline on that. Okay, 1864. But instead, how does the war change maybe when Grant moves to the Eastern Theater? Why does Lee not take up command of the Union Army and does the Confederate? And then from there, it boils down to more, I guess, rank and file or regular folk. And, outside of some cameos by Lincoln, certainly Secretary of State William Seward, in Rebel Falls, almost everybody else is kind of regular people, and they're caught up in this. And it's not so much that they've been swept into it. They've often made choices on which side or things they're trying to do. And that then speaks to them and their makeup. And all of a sudden that to me becomes much more believable than learning that Vicksburg fell, I think, days before Gettysburg. See, I would flunk that test today.
Right. Well, and I think what you're getting at, right, goes beyond character and it talks about why story works, right?
Yeah.
We can appreciate, I feel like the scaffolding of history, right? The dates are important. The big players are critical. But that's a surface level to get into the whys and the hows and the human aspect. You go through that door, and suddenly there are countless stories of the individuals, many of whom have very similar stories. All of us totally unique as individuals, but it's this push and pull of what political and historical currents are making someone choose sides. Is it family? Is it
Mhm.
financial, etc. And hopefully you'll forgive me because I mean this very much as a compliment, but I did think inevitably, and it's a me thing, but what I like about your humanizing or any historical fiction that does kind of the extra work to make these actual human beings seem like human beings. I think of the epic, song by the band, the
Mhm.
night they drove Old Dixie down. The
Mhm.
reason that I think one of the reasons that masterpiece resonates, it's very complicated, right? They're not celebrating the South because I read some superficial criticism saying, well, why do people love that song? It's about a rebel soldier. And it's like, listen to the words. This isn't
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
isn't general. This isn't, someone that's fighting for cynical reasons. They're swept up into a family conflict that had decades or centuries of backstory, but we're seeing the poverty, we're seeing the despair, we're seeing these universal themes like war is not pretty, and the little guys and gals are the ones that are trampled in it. But this type of work helps us understand the big issues better by miniaturizing them, if you will, into individual lives. And again, those things have to work together, you know, symbiotically, which is something that you're just able to do, which is masterful craft.
No, thank you. And it's fine. Yeah, that's a great song written by a Canadian,
Right.
matter of fact. But
Yeah.
even I think what we're looking for often is the way to relate to it is some degree of humanity with it, and some degree of and then I can understand it. And it's funny when you were talking about that, Sean. I was thinking about toward the end of writing Rebel Falls, I really, really, I wanted to have almost a cameo, but I wanted a scene with Abraham Lincoln. And you're going, oh, that's nuts. And you go to the Ford's Theater and you go to that visitor center across 10th, I believe, and you look at 3 stories tall of books written about Lincoln. You're going, what am I going to do here? And I
Right.
and I'm desperate, because I can't have it be the same old caricature. And so I lucked out. I went to the Soldiers Home in Northwest Washington, which I highly recommend to anybody who's in DC. A totally different thing. And it's
Mhm.
where Lincoln's kind of summer White House was. It's up, it's way up kind of 16th past Florida and stuff. He used to ride his horse up there. And he was very much wanted to get out of the White House because his son had died of typhoid fever. I mean, all this stuff. And I did a tour and I was one of the few people on it. And they took us in front of this roll top desk and I'm going, what are we looking at this for? And the guy opened it up and she said, oh, this drawer right here, this is very special. And I'm going, I have no idea what you're talking about. But Lincoln, during the last year, well, certainly of the war, he would have ideas come into his head, a little bit like me with my spiral notebook on the Metro. And when
Sure.
those come to you, you write them down. And he would write them down, he'd put them in his hat, he'd put them in his coat, and he would lose. It would fall out. But he had this valet that was awesome. And the valet would find these over the course of the day, shove them in this drawer. And with all the pressure of the war and everything, Lincoln already had insomnia. He was up all the time. And he would come like at 1, 2 o'clock in the morning to this desk, and he knew his valet had put those slips of paper in that drawer. And he'd open up, oh, here's a good line. Here's something. He wrote Emancipation Proclamation. He wrote the Gettysburg Address. He wrote them all pretty much during his time at the Soldiers' Home. And I think in some ways that maybe speaks to craft, but it also speaks to just that story that they told me. Then I could get into Lincoln. Lincoln wasn't, you know, that big statue you see at the Lincoln Memorial anymore. He
Right.
became somebody I could work into a scene.
Yeah, and I think right, that's Shakespeare, right? Kings and soldiers, and
Right.
we're all ultimately much more similar than we are different. It strikes me as you say that. I really appreciate that backstory. Another thing we're kind of losing, I think, in American culture, thinking about Thomas Jefferson through Abraham Lincoln through Barack Obama, uh, these American leaders were very well educated, appreciated education, and were excellent writers.
Yeah,
So
they could use words.
separating, which you can't do, but separating entirely their political views and their histories, just as practitioners of the English language, some of our best role models in terms of, in Lincoln's case, succinct,
Mhm.
absolutely compulsively understandable with that urgency, kind of combining, which that classic 19th century makes me think of Melville. Like you can read one page by Lincoln or Melville, and you're getting Bible, you're
Yeah,
getting,
you're getting it
getting the
all.
whole history of language,
And
and
you're
this.
getting that sense of humor too. I mean, if you look at his,
Yes, yes,
anytime I'm in Washington, when I come back, I go to the Lincoln Memorial if I have time. Okay, you got Gettysburg Address on one side, you got the second inaugural on the other. And I love that in second inaugural because it kind of starts off, it's kind of, he's almost kind of, thank you for re-electing me type of thing, which was very much, which is
yeah,
kind of one of the underpinnings of Rebel Falls, how close that came to not being true.
right,
But near the top of the second column, I'd urge anybody who goes there next time, it's a very short line that he wrote. And he's been kind of talking about the start of the war and even the country and how we got to this point, I guess. And toward the top of the second column is just a very short line. It either is, and the war came, or just the war came. And you just kind of go, man, that's him almost like flipping off the founding fathers, like going, thanks for leaving me this, guys. You
yeah,
guys passed the buck, and the buck ended with me.
yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it occurs to me, I'd written down everything we've talked about to this point. I think if we're talking about history, we're talking about writing, we're talking about being an informed American citizen. I had jotted down both while I was reading and preparing the classic Mark Twain quote, but I don't think I've ever invoked this to a writer that I admire. But reading you, and again, I'm talking about your book, I'm talking about your Substack and the other writings. The Mark Twain quote, which is very well known, is travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness. Many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Broad, wholesome, charitable views of men and things cannot be acquired by vegetating in one little corner of the earth all one's lifetime. I think that applies to your sensibility, the types of things you write about, but also the
Mm,
spirit that obviously animates both of us as thinkers, as teachers, as people who
mhm,
respect writing and tradition, while also being willing to push back on tradition and understanding tradition is
mhm,
also a work in progress and can hopefully be refined and more inclusive. But this notion of, you're not a baseball guy, you're not a historical fiction writer, you're all of these things, but they all exist in this mind that wants to see places, wants to understand people. Talk a little bit
mhm.
about how you view that, and I guess both the literal and figurative, literal travel,
Yeah.
Ontario, but also the figurative, like if one's reading, one is not staying inside, a comfortable space.
No, no, it just opens up world upon world. I mean, it has been planned, but I guess it's going to happen. I don't know, my wife is going. We're going to Antarctica in November, and I didn't put this together. She put together the trip, and then she's the one who realized, and she's traveled a great deal too. I mean, I love traveling with her, but she's the one who put together this particular trip. We kind of take turns, and she's the one the other night, about a month or so ago, if we get to Antarctica, this is your seventh continent. And I went, I hadn't even thought of that. And it
Wow.
is. I sat down and added them up, and that wasn't a goal. It's just the way it kind of happened. And it's funny because I remember when we moved to Washington area from the West Coast, even though I grew up in the East, we were on the West Coast for a fair amount of time, and I love the Bay Area a lot. We were living on a sailboat in the Bay Area. It kind of seems like a dream now. And but we moved back here, and my wife worked for many years at the Washington Post. But I remember coming, you travel and just getting outside the box you're in your own head can really it's just going to help you make the next couple steps. And the story I'm trying to tell is we came to DC and I wasn't quite ready for DC, after being in the Bay Area. And
Yeah.
and I told Jackie, my wife, I just said, bear with me. I'm getting up to speed here, but I'm not there yet. And I need to take a trip. And I went to the Himalayas and I followed in the path of Peter Matheson, the snow leopard. I didn't make it all the way to the, Crystal Palace and such, but
Yeah.
it just opened my mind. And there's certain things that are tugging on anybody at certain points. My wife at that point was very much looking to, we're getting off the sailboat. We're buying a house. I think it's time to start a family, all this. And maybe I wasn't quite ready for it. And I remember, boy, we're out. Gosh, it had to be 10, 11 days out. And, you tend to camp in somebody's courtyard or backyard because things can get a little woolly, between dogs and stuff in the Himalayas. And and we were camping out, and I remember it was a cold night, and I started to hear voices, and I went, "What's going on?" And I pulled on my parka, and I came around to the front of the house, and it was beautiful sky. It was totally clear. You see every star imaginable. And this guy, and the Polly's was a dad was talking with his daughter in English and showing her the constellations. And I kind of just sat there, chilling with him for a while. And I said, "Why are you doing this? Why?" And he said, "The only way she's going to be able to make it in the world is probably through tourism and working with people like you. So she needs to know as much English as she can." And and that blew me away. So much so that when I landed at Reagan National, like a week or so later, there's my wife greeting me, and I blew her mind because I came off the plane and just said, "Let's start a family." And it all went back to that scene.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable.
But that's why you travel. You travel, you set out an itinerary and say, "We're going to hit this and this," but then there's certain things about some guy telling his daughter the constellations in English that suddenly flips your whole life.
Well, and Tim, what keeps coming back to me talking to you, I mean, again, having read you and admired you, but talking to you, I don't know if I've ever really thought about it this clearly before, but there again, speaking of kind of blowing up the cliches of how writers, there are plenty of introverts and misanthropes, just like there are in any profession. But I think what we're talking about here is this an intense curiosity, an intense love of learning, and an intense love of experience, which means at some point there has to be at least a fascination, if not love, of human beings. And I think that the writing that resonates with a lot of people, a lot of these ingredients are baked in. It's not accidental. Just like, I do worry or think about a 21st century generation that, has the devices, which again, I'm not even going to go down that like that cliched, things
Mm.
are always changing. But if someone's experience, even if they're on the World Wide Web, which, blows our childhood experiences away in terms of scope, but if someone can get the whole world from their bedroom, they're missing out on these human moments that inspire careers, families, books, all of that. But again, I
Mhm.
think you synthesize these real kind of old school sensibilities of curiosity, passion, but just as a love of understanding how people tick, and that goes into your writing.
Oh, thank you. And I think it's where I get stuck, Sean, is when I'm too much in my head or my cave or my room.
Yep.
If anything I've learned over the years is that's when I've got to get out and you know see somebody else, talk to somebody else completely, off the deal. Because what you're doing is you're opening the door for surprise and serendipity, because you think you got it all wired. You think, "Oh, we're going to do this with this and this," and then it opens up something else. And I find that with my characters too. I mean, I still kind of do when I'm stuck, but I used to outline relentlessly, it's going to go this. And then if the
Yep.
characters start doing something a little different on the page, I'd almost become miffed. I go, how dare you? You know, when this, I'm the writer, you're supposed to be doing this. And if I've learned anything over the years, is when that starts to happen, get the hell out of the way because it's getting good. You know, there, you know, your subconscious or whatever is going on is taking over the story and almost always will take it in a much better, believable way than what your outline has.
Yeah, I think that gets to the whole idea that our subconscious is much smarter than we are. And um,
Exactly.
that actually makes me, I take every opportunity to shout him out because I love him so much. But George Saunders, one of my
Mhm.
favorite writers, but teachers of writing, will talk about his own process when he's asked. And I've read him on a number of occasions talk about how because he has what I would call, very political energy in his writing, but I wouldn't call any of his fiction political. I certainly wouldn't call it political, but he's talked about how when he senses, much less what he intends, when he senses he's kind of shoehorning the narrative and the exposition for predetermined, that's this, right? And that's the
Right.
outline. This is the bad guy and this is the good guy, but allowing yourself to kind of go with that flow opens up, ironically, I think in some instances, ironically, it really reveals the depths and the contradictions
Right.
because that's what
Right.
real humans are. And I'm certainly always cognizant of that in my own writing. Not wanting it to be too easy, or if you know in advance where you're headed, you're already cutting yourself off from discovery. And when discovery
Yeah. A
happens
lot of possibilities.
mid-process, or mid-project, to me anyway, and it's taken a while to understand, those are the gifts. Those are disruptions, and they might sidetrack you. I love your because I think every writer's been there. Like, I'm the puppet master, get in line, and you recognize, whoa, let me actually get out of the way.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny. I've been thinking, God, I haven't thought about him in a while, but I'm thinking Alan Schuss again, who had a major impact on my career. You know, we used to talk about kind of that sweet spot in writing, and you know, he had a couple different variations of it, but he said if you're too much in your head, that's not going to work. If it's too much in your heart, that's not going to work. And he always used to talk about this line that's 45-degree angle between them. And it's so tough to stay on that line because all of a sudden, oh, I'm thinking crazy stuff plot wise, or I'm too much in the heart and it's becoming a little too sappy. But
Yeah.
you know, he said as much as you can be on that line, and he was absolutely right.
Speaking very, very broadly, I want to be careful here not to stereotype, but speaking from my own reading over the years, when I see what is sometimes derided as MFA fiction, it's a lot of this. And when I read less experienced writers where I think some good ideas here, the execution is not satisfying, there's a lot of this. And I love the 45 degree. I think that's a perfect way to succinctly distill what we're talking about, these competing energies that make it breathe, give it
Hmm.
intelligence, and give it resonance. It's not a political screed. It's not written to get revenge. It's not written to satisfy the writer.
Right,
It's written
right.
to almost dissatisfy the writer because I think if you're a little bit in awe of how things came together, you've opened yourself up to allowing, different ingredients to enter the broth and definitely make it a little bit more spicy than it would otherwise be if you just had an idea, everything flowed, you outlined it
Mhm.
and knocked it out. You know, it might not feel exactly right.
Yeah, or it couldn't be, or might not be as big or as good as it could be. You know, in a sense, you're kind of letting other elements in, and that takes some doing because, you know, as you know, writing it's lonely. I mean, you feel like you're on edge. You feel like you're out there a lot of times, and then to let even other factors in, it's much easier to say, no, no, stay outside the door. I'll finish this up in here. You know, but you know, often when you do, that's where things take off and go different ways. And that's what I find with my work I need to be reminded of. And when I am, it turns out very well.
Yeah, while we've been talking, I feel like I have brought this up before, but I think of the two extremes that come to mind and I think in both instances, it's extreme privilege and it's earned privilege in both instances. But there's Stephen King, who I've read many times, and I believe him when he says I start a book. I have no idea where it's going. I'm like, God, that's wonderful. It's inspirational. It's also must be nice to really be in a place financially and otherwise where you're like, I don't even know what I'm going to do. Many of us mortals have bills to pay and have to kind of work in writing wherever we can. But then the other extreme is another artist I admire a great deal, but whose work, even the stuff I love, kind of can leave me cold at times, is Stanley Kubrick,
Mm,
who is notorious for he had a vision, he was God, and
hmm
he would bend the actors to his will to
hmm
astonishingly brilliant results. But when I talk about some of his work, even the stuff I love, there is, not so ironically, to me anyway, this sort of lack of humanity and this
Yeah.
kind of coldness, which I know in some ways is exactly what he was going for. But somewhere between the Stephen King or insert name of writer here that's like, I just go with the flow, and the super uptight control freak, the real magic seems to be somewhere in the middle of that.
Right, right. And the crazy thing is, as you well know, each project's so different that trying to fuse or find that yin and yang often is the journey or the dilemma in itself. I mean, it's there, had somebody asking me the other day, well, this must be, you've done X amount of books, it must be easier. And I'm going, no, each one's difficult because each one's like a puzzle, and maybe I've got a little bit more, tools or patience or something, but each one's so different, it keeps me up at night.
Tim, virtually every writer I've talked to in this series or in my whole life has confirmed that it doesn't get easier. And just again, speaking only for myself, that used to be, if not discouraging, it was intimidating. And I've learned to really embrace and love that. When I
Yeah.
read, whether it's Philip Roth, Stephen King, whomever, say, I got to start fresh every time. Martin Amis has talked about it. Writers
hmm
that were at the peak of their craft, when you read a master talking about how they almost have to teach themselves the whole process, why not find inspiration and solace in that? Like if the masters, we can look at baseball, right? If
Right.
the best hitters and pitchers are in the batting cages, it starts to make sense. It's not that they have to work harder. It's to achieve what you envision, you have to push yourself. And if it was that easy, or there was a trick to it, like I wrote a novel. All the other ones are going to be easy. How good could it possibly be if it was easy? I mean, it doesn't mean it
Right.
has to be hard, but if it was easy, what would a novelist really be giving to the world? So I've learned maybe it's a rationalization or a defense mechanism, but I've actually learned to really lean into that, in being in awe of the whole process and why should it be easy or fun all the time? It's work.
Right. It's work, and also there's a potential gift there too. Each project, you start off thinking, oh, okay, why can't I just do it all over again? But there's something else now to be learned. There's something else that needs to be discovered, and that's sometimes really, really difficult, but that's in a sense what you as the writer are going to potentially gain out of it. That's why, I drive 13 hours to Ottawa when I'm 2.5 weeks away from deadline, and everybody's like going, "What are you doing?" And but I need to walk that street. I need to hear the ghosts and hear the whispers. Just to maybe it moves me a little bit closer to understanding what some of these characters are about and what they're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I always qualify this by noting, as if people that know me don't already know this very well. I'm not an author whose books have been made into movies, so it's a little bit easier for me to say this. But as I've gotten older, I can affirm and attest to the fact that when you have a project, whether it's a poem, a short story, or a novel, seeing it through on your own terms and pushing yourself and feeling like whatever happens to it, we all hope the best, not only for our own work, we should all want the best for all writers. But if it's been achieved to one's satisfaction, there is a contentment that comes from that cannot be approximated by rewards or sales or accolades. Again, those things are all necessary. They're vital. They're welcome, right? But
Sure.
every single time I've completed a piece where I felt I left it all on the field. It doesn't matter if it gets published. Like I knew I didn't cheat myself. You learn so much about yourself as a writer and as a human being when you see a project through and do it the best you can. As quaint as that might sound, that's probably the number one thing that I've come to believe in the process of trying to be a writer.
Right. And what you've done, I think, just for your mental health is immeasurable. Instead of burying it deep down inside you, you've brought it out to the world. Now, who's to say if people are going to applaud or boo or whatever, but I think it's just devastating to have it always wrapped up inside you. And I think some people, I was reading the other day, and I think it was a good definition, writers or just anybody, creatives or anybody trying to do any kind of major project. I think we get a little bit confused sometimes between motion and action. Motion is kind of, oh, I'm going to do this. You start doing lists and such, or you start outlining or whatever.
Mhm.
Action is you sit down and actually start writing it. And action is where what can keep you sane. Motion doesn't keep you sane. I mean that's a lot of parlor games in a way. So it's and I've been fortunate. I've got readers, I've gotten a response, but still, I times I think, where would I be if I hadn't dared tell these stories? If I hadn't, I'd probably be bad shape somewhere, all these weird things dads are having, baseball in Cuba and Canadian poets and such. But, you get it out and then you feel ready to move ahead with what's next.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all, right? We all contain multitudes, as Whitman said. And I think some
Yes.
of us that are very intelligent and sensitive and passionate contain many multitudes. You are definitely that person. You've been able to channel that into your work, which has not only clearly improved your own life, but has made your readers smarter, happier, better informed. That's a tremendous gift, and I thank you for sharing that with us. I offer you any parting shot. There's so much we didn't get to cover, so consider this an automatic invite to come back
Oh,
anytime to
yes.
continue this
Love to.
discussion. But for today, we talked about citizen historians. Any parting words of admonition or advice or a nugget of wisdom to share with some folks that are trying to get a project started?
Take the first step. The first step will lead to the second step. Again, drop the scheming and I don't know. What's the old Springsteen line? Show a little faith, there's magic in the night. That's that's all we can do. And you know, you surround yourself with your compadres and people to keep you going. But some of it, I guess what I'm trying to say, Sean, is trying to, I don't know, wrap it up, is we tend to think in such, big cosmic ways,
Yeah.
and that's cool. I mean, that's needed. But almost every big thing, big dream, big project, it started with all these little incremental things, and they add up. I had some of my students ask me one time, well, to do a book, I guess that means I've got to write the scenes bigger, they got to be, longer or something. I go, no, you just write more of them. They're kind of the same size. And you just, in a sense, the string is longer. That's all. And once you realize that, you take a deep breath and you go.
Yeah. And it's a long season. And
It's
you
always a
know,
long season. And we play
it,
it a game at a time.
we do a game at a time, and if things don't work out, there's always next season. But it's part of the grind, it's part of the process, it's part of the joy of the game. Tim, you exude the joy of the game. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. I want to both congratulate you and thank you for Rebel Falls. Amazing revelation to hear that there's another book already in the can. We look forward to hearing more about that. I'll put this all over the promo, but just for people watching right now, people that are like, I got to go check that guy out. Tim, how do they find you online?
Oh, look for me on my website, just timwendel.com. There's a contact button there too. There's stuff about my books. There's stuff about the Substack columns, all this. I'm on Substack too. You can find that as, end notes and backstory. But I think the website, I fear sometimes I confuse people, and if I do a little bit, reach out to me and go, "What the hell are you talking about there?" I'll reply to you.
There, there's an offer that cannot be refused. Tim, be well, enjoy the playoffs, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. So great to be with you, Sean. Great show. Thank you.
Likewise, likewise. Thanks for checking out Some Things Considered. Drop me a line if you want to be a guest or you know someone that should be a guest, and we'll see you soon. Be safe, be well, and keep writing. Thanks for tuning in to Some Things Considered. Find out more, including how to be a guest, at seanmurphy.net. Reminder, we are obsessed with story and celebrating creativity. Also, we're here to advocate for the arts by any means necessary. Drop us a line, get involved, and support our creatives who are the lifeblood of our culture. I'm Sean Murphy. See you on the next episode of Some Things Considered.